I'm Joan Gore, and I am working with the association AIEA to create a digital archive for research purposes and for purposes of interest in the field of international education. This archive is being developed with people my age, I have white hair, you will see, and who are, if not retiring, beginning to approach retirement age, who have been the second generation of people after World War II to move international education forward and to see a vast transformation in how international education in the higher education world is practiced and how policy is formed for it. Today we are talking to Dr. JoAnn McCarthy, who is a past president of AIEA, a long-time member of AIEA, and who has been the senior international officer at 4 different U.S. higher education institutions, as well as continuing today in a role of consulting that involves bridging higher education with private enterprise institutions, another newer development in our field. So let me, JoAnn, ask first to talk a little bit about the trajectory of your career, where you started, and actually you and I knew each other when our children were children, and so we spent some time together in the state of Virginia, and I think you started before that in Illinois.
I did.
And how you moved in your career. Let's talk about that path first.
I think it's important to understand the context of that trajectory because it was in the mid-70s. And as you know, the women's movement was just getting some traction about then. So careers for women were more of a challenge than they are today.
Yes.
And I came into this with a PhD in 1974, which was right about the time my children began to arrive. So I was working only part-time, cobbling together various grant-supported jobs at the university where my husband was on his way to tenure professor. And I think it was one of those things where I was making choices of not being on a tenure track, even though I had a PhD. It was in French, and you know, there were limited opportunities, let's say, and I wasn't free to move. So those were the kinds of decisions early in the career that shape the rest of your career for years to come.
That's right.
And so I was working part-time, quite happily so, while the kids were not in school yet. But by the time my youngest was in kindergarten, a senior international officer position fell in my lap at that institution. It had been occupied by a very esteemed senior history professor who had been there forever. He retired, and the new associate provost in charge of filling that position decides that they're going to take that position and just compress it down into half the salary. I mean, it's not important anyway, right? And
oh,
so,
yes, here we go. Yes, we've all...
So we're going to save a lot of money on this administrative position. They cut the salary in half, I mean, to the point that no senior professor was any longer interested in it.
Of course.
Which opened the way for me, non-tenure track, not full-time, but with a fairly solid international background and language capabilities. So I ended up in the pool of being very competitive, got the job. Well, I was thrilled. I mean, this was 1983, and it was my first full-time job after finishing my PhD, and I remember thinking, well, it's a good thing it's a second income, because you could,
right.
you know, you couldn't live on it. And so I set about that year just you know, a whirling dervish of activity. And to the extent that I think the provost was embarrassed to have been paying twice as much to a man who had had that job and done half as much as I had been doing.
Right.
So I did get an immediate raise and started.
You had an unusual provost.
I did. And so in any event, that was the beginning of the career. I was really given carte blanche to build study abroad, to build faculty development, to build our international student programming, international house. It was a really great training ground there in the middle of the prairies in Illinois that, you know, people were just beginning to wake up to globalization.
Mm-hmm.
And I had I remember thinking back in the 70s as I was doing curriculum development and teacher training and things like that out at the College of Education, these part-time jobs that I'd had. It was just really the very first inkling of how to teach global perspectives and why it was needed.
Right.
And so, you know, as my daughter and my son were born in the mid to late 70s, I found myself thinking a lot about what they were going to need to know by the time they graduated from college, you know, and approximately Y2K, you know, the year 2000 was going to be this absolutely pivotal year, you know, it was all in our minds. Oh, 2000 is approaching. And what does that mean? There was something symbolic about it.
Yes.
And people were looking at it 10, 20 years out. And so that was an environment where people were beginning to realize how globally connected we all were and what kinds of skills were going to be needed. And of course, this was still pre-internet. This was basically the fax just being invented.
Right.
I mean, technologically, I can remember thinking, you know, the pace of my work at Illinois State was so different from what it is now because it took 2 weeks for a letter to get to Southeast Asia, 2 weeks for the response to come back. So there was a whole month there. I finished that letter and that was done for a month. And now, of course,
it's done for an hour.
It's done for an hour, and you know the pace has just ramped up considerably. So I think context, you know, as it evolved over the years, really changed what my job was. It changed the pace of that job. It changed the urgency of it. It changed the level of interest among students, among faculty. It changed the level of resources that were available. And somewhere around 1987, I guess, I attended my first AIEA conference in
When was the AIEA started? Can you remind me?
Well, I think about 83 or
okay.
so, but I'm guessing somebody will have that definitely pinpointed somewhere. But
oh, we have it.
I was in Guadalajara for the first time, and I had heard about AIEA. I was a member of NAFSA.
Yes.
And AIEA had this reputation of being an old boys network. You know, that there was a handful of movers and shakers, all of them 50 plus, and all meeting annually in warm places.
I remember exactly what you're talking about. That was the perception that was being developed.
Yeah, so anyway, I kind of resisted joining. I thought, it doesn't sound like anything I would be interested in. I mean, I really need practical help, but I really wasn't getting it from NAFSA either. And so when I went to my first one in Guadalajara, I didn't really know anybody. But I remember it being about 80 to 90 people. And, you know, you could all fit around about 10 tables in a room. There was no, you know, exhibition hall, certainly. And there was limited programming, you know. I mean, there were sessions, but a lot of them were what they called self-generated sessions, you know. You wanted to talk about development? Okay, well, that's in room 4, you know.
Right.
That kind of thing. So anyway, I went to this thing, and I kind of was like a fly on the wall because I saw 3 other women, Judy Young from Texas,
Judy.
and Eunice French from Missouri Rolla, Barbara Byrne, the inimitable
sort of the
Barbara
esteemed,
Byrne,
famed
the grande dame of international education from the University of Massachusetts, and myself. 4 women in that room of 90 men.
Oh my goodness.
And it was fascinating. I mean, I learned a lot, I have to say, but this was definitely an environment that has changed radically over the years. And I remember very vividly sitting next to Ralph Smuckler from Michigan State at the dinner that night. And I know that I got $10,000 worth of consulting out of that guy that night, because he was so generous with his time, with his insights. You know, who was I? I mean, wasn't from a big name university. I was just, literally a kid in my mid-30s.
So this male network actually were open to really helping.
They really were. And, Barbara, she was a firebrand.
Barbara was a male.
She just took up. She took on the boys.
She did. She was
tiny
amazing.
Little woman.
I know.
A tiny little woman. But I remember she led a coup. Somebody was being elected to the board that had bothered to show up for the election or the meeting, and Barbara was offended by that, and she led an insurrection from the floor that got somebody else elected to the board that night, and it happened to be her. That was the first penetration of the leadership of AIEA, and she eventually, I believe, was the first woman president. But in any event, she was inspiring as well. I used to share hotel rooms with Barbara. She was very frugal, and she'd call me up before any of these conferences and ask if I had a roommate yet. Well, usually I wasn't planning on having one, but you didn't want to say no to Barbara.
Right.
And again, this was invaluable mentoring that was taking place. But she did wake up at 5:30 every day to go swimming.
I've heard this.
It was a little disruptive, but she was a force of nature, and I really learned a lot from that lady.
It's so interesting because in a way, what we're talking about is that first generation with Barbara. Right. The people after World War II.
Ralph Smuckler, Joe Neal, Barbara Byrne.
And they're among the people I interviewed in the first project that I did for CIEE, who were coming to their retirement years. And they made such contributions, and they saw so much change. But what they also did was with AIEA and other formations and organizations, and within other organizations, they laid the foundation for our generation to take the next giant step.
That's entirely true. And I think there's a kind of a passing of the torch.
Yes.
Kind of nexus somewhere along the line where you feel that change happening. And we were talking earlier, I feel it happening now. With the expansion of this organization, with all the new faces, with the changes in universities that are beginning to value this and put people of substance in these positions who, in generations past might not have been interested in an administrative job, but who now find it congruent with their teaching and their research and want to be in these positions. Part of the transformation of an institution. So I think it's all contextual as you go along, responding to new drivers, responding to new environments, responding to new realizations among the rank and file that this is important. This isn't just a frill. This isn't just a great exit job for somebody who spent years in the saddle teaching,
or as a diplomat,
or somebody who's exiting their career through higher education, a diplomatic career through higher education. So it's a serious job.
It's a very serious.
It's a strategically placed position, and previously I think that was all over the map.
Well, I think it's fair to say from the research that I've done and from the experience that both of us have had, is that it was during the time frame of the development of AIEA that the perception within higher education about the role of international education changed. So that in the 80s and early 90s, it was non-existent as a mission in higher education institutions.
Never mentioned.
Never mentioned. And it was oftentimes very low salaried. It was oftentimes very capable people, often women, in many of the other than the most senior positions, who were appointed, who were trying to move it forward. But in that process of moving it forward, and in that process of a new discourse developing, it really did become, and AIEA was probably a critical part of this. With NAFSA, with AIEA, eventually with Forum and other organizations, international organizations, EAIE, etc., becoming such a visible part and growing so quickly that by the end of the century, it really was in mission statements. And so your own career must have followed that trajectory. So we left you off at Illinois.
Right. I started at Illinois State University as the underdog director, executive director of International Studies and Programs, which was essentially a study abroad operation and international house that was very vibrant due to its extraordinary director, Marilyn Boyd. But you know, it was in farm country, and foreign students were a bit of a you know, just an unusual addition to the community, a community called Normal, Illinois. I mean, what a wonderful spot to bring in a few hundred international students and have them really warmly welcomed and integrated into the community.
Which internationalizes everyone.
That's right. And International House was the focal point, the community programming that we did there. Global forum where Palestinians and Israelis would go at it back and forth in a controlled environment of discussion of perspectives and viewpoints. It was so valuable what happened there. My kids grew up on Friday night culture nights at International House and met people from all over the world. In Normal, Illinois, that would not have been possible without the university. So that was a real plus.
But as you moved, you must have also been moving in concert with these changes in the field.
And I left Illinois State. I had an offer from a former professor at Illinois State who had risen to the presidency of Old Dominion University
in Virginia.
And I joined them for about 7 years, I believe. But Jim Cook was president there, and this was the only time I ever reported directly to a president. And boy, talk about fast track. He was a committed internationalist and very, I think, influential among presidents. He wrote several books on the topic and was quoted widely, and still to this day is a very valued consultant to the presidency. And Jim took international under his wing. Direct report. He didn't want it coming through the pros. You know, he wanted managed what happened there. He found us a donor for a building. We had, you know, just front and center, very high visible aspects of engagement with the curriculum, with the faculty, etc. And I think he showed me what a committed senior leadership could accomplish. This was the first time I'd ever attempted a major strategic plan. And for a while there, I was doing, you know, conferences over and over again about strategic planning, because this was pretty in-depth. It was pretty comprehensive. It was before comprehensive internationalization really took hold as a concept. You know, most of us were import-export specialists, but the comprehensive internationalization was taking place in the early 90s, I think. And that was the point at which you really needed, you couldn't be on the sidelines tinkering away and having any impact. You had to have your president, provost, and deans on board because you were messing with the real heart of the university, the curriculum, the faculty, the students. And so integrating these global concepts of knowledge and skills and attitudes that you want your graduates to have when they enter the global workforce. This was going to take more than a study abroad experience for 3% of your students.
Right.
This meant absolutely transformation of the university's teaching,
yes.
research, and service.
Yes.
And this is not easily done, but it is impossible to do without a president and provost and deans. So this was my first experience with a president who wanted to help make that happen.
Right.
And
there were no roadmaps for how to do it too,
there
because
really
you have to,
weren't.
you had to invent it yourself because it
in
wasn't
fact,
there.
Comprehensive internationalization grew out of, you know, the whole idea that you had to touch every aspect of the university. You had to change what a university did.
Right.
And I think out of that came that phrase, comprehensive internationalization, because when you talk about internationalizing a university, people have in their heads what that means to them.
Right.
And what it meant, and it still means to an awful lot of people, is international students in, study abroad, out.
Right.
And comprehensive internationalization took that to a whole new level. And I think that was a real transformational period. It was gradual, it didn't happen overnight, but just the genesis of that phrase tells me that something was happening in the university sector.
Right. So, at Old Dominion,
yep.
What did that mean in terms of creating policy and creating practice? What were some of the examples of things you were able to institute there and as you moved elsewhere that reflected this idea of comprehensive internationalization? And how did AIEA help you?
I guess, let me step back to Illinois first, because one of the first things that I experimented with was faculty development. Because I figured I could only do so much, but until there were legions of people who thought like I did, not much else was going to happen. And the opportunity there came with the opening up of China. And in the mid-'80s, we had an exchange, one of the very first exchanges in 1983, with the Foreign Languages Publications Bureau in Beijing, which was put together in such a way that they would send us 3 editors to polish their English and learn about American culture and be able to speak more knowledgeably and fluently about American life in their publications like China Reconstructs, Beijing Daily, you know, all of these kinds of publications, which were, quite frankly, propaganda arms of the Communist Party in China. But in any event, we were so thrilled to have peek behind the curtain in China in the 80s that we worked this in such a way that it became an exchange. It's going to be a student exchange. But there in the cornfields of Illinois, there was precious little interest among our 20-year-old students about going to communist China.
Right.
I haven't been to London yet.
Right.
Was a frequent response to me. Like there's some kind of progression. But in any event, it was clear that I wasn't going to be able to support this financially because I needed so many outbound to contribute to a pool of money.
Right.
So that when the Chinese editors came in, I had money to pay their expenses.
Exactly.
Okay? It was an asymmetrical exchange.
Right.
And that's how we financed it. But out of desperation, I opened it to faculty the first year.
What a wonderful idea.
And in the end, that was the smartest thing I could have done because my plan was for faculty to get so excited about it that they would then recruit students.
Right.
What I didn't anticipate was that faculty wouldn't let go of it.
Right.
And year after year after year, you know, I had the College of Business wanted to focus on businesses here in China, and so we would create a whole agenda around business. Then the fine arts faculty wanted to go, and it was all about film and orchestras and opera and all of that. And then the next year it was science and technology, and then the next year it was, you know, writers and what have you.
Actually, it's phenomenal.
Well, over the course of a few years, we had over 100 faculty members spend a month in China in the mid-'80s.
Which probably transformed your institution.
Well, it did, because we started teaching Chinese long before anybody else was teaching it, other than the big, you know,
Right.
Michigans and Dukes and institutions like that. But we had a real interest, growing interest in it. And of course, finally, the students did get to go. But they were faculty-led, you know, at this point. But this was, you know, this month in China cost the faculty member $500.
You're
And
kidding.
the rest of it was $500 from me, $500 from the dean, you know, and you cobbled it together. It was an exchange, so those 15 faculty members with their $2,000, you know,
Pockets,
each of them, went into that bank account that supported these 3 Chinese editors for 2 years.
Wow.
So when I say it wasn't an asymmetrical exchange, it made it possible for them to go financially.
Right.
It made it impossible for them to refuse to go, frankly.
Right.
I mean, when else would you spend a month in China
For $500. Right.
and be totally taken care of, never have to open your wallet unless you're buying souvenirs.
Right.
So it was a fascinating experience for faculty, even some key staff with. And so the point being here, that if you're the lone voice in the wilderness, you've got to convert some allies first.
Right.
And I always kind of joked with my colleagues at AIEA that if they were having problems getting things done, co-opt them with a plane ticket, you know, because
That's right.
actually, you know, when people are really either dead set against anything international, or if they were just agnostic about it, it usually meant they had no experience with it.
Right.
And those are people where you should be investing your travel dollars and trying to find ways for the bug to bite them.
Right, and if you want to talk about comprehensive internationalization, you now have faculty who come back and talk to the kids from the foreign country.
And they're very often much more credible than somebody who's selling study abroad.
Right, exactly.
And so I think it's, and it's much more important when you're trying to embed it in a curriculum. One of the things that you have to get over with parents is that this is a frill.
Right.
We
Right.
can't afford that. We can barely afford to get this kid into college. We're
Right.
borrowing money to do that. And you're
Right.
telling me I've got to send them overseas too?
Right.
And
Oh.
that's a tough argument.
And it still is. And in
Yeah.
fact, it's still 3% of the American population, the higher education population, who go abroad, which means that comprehensive internationalization is addressing the other 97% who need to have something of this experience on the American campus. And that's what faculty development brings. And that's what bringing in folks brings, if you use them in the right ways.
There's a downside to it too. And that, I think, this is my personal prejudice,
Right.
is that faculty who then turn around and create a faculty-led study abroad trip,
Right.
which is the fastest growing sector
Right.
for a lot of reasons, financial,
Financial,
time,
otherwise, right.
whatever. And it's better than nothing,
Right.
but it's not the total immersion
No.
that you would get at Link, where you're going to really develop some language skills,
Right.
some really deep, intimate knowledge of a culture, have the opportunity to really separate from your home culture instead of traveling around in a kind of, you know, this bubble. And I think that you lose something by doing that, you gain something by doing that. It's nothing but trade-offs, but
Yeah.
all things being equal, I wish students had more authentic experiences abroad than they're currently getting.
I
By
also
and
still
large.
think about the 97% who are never going to go abroad.
Exactly.
and what it is comprehensive internationalization is doing for those students. What's going on in American campuses to ensure that they are exposed to the idea of international, even though they may not go internationally.
Which, you know, brings me to a giant leap in my career, this new area that I'm working in now of bridging the higher education and the private sector resources, is that I think we're doing more now in truly integrating international students into the mainstream of American university life than we've ever been able to do before. It's a resource-intense model. You've got to have people who are not only trained and experienced in this, but consciously assigned to make this their day-to-day job.
Right.
And it doesn't happen by osmosis. It doesn't happen by sitting next to each other in a class.
No.
And we all know that the students who come from various countries tend to congregate. They'll take over their own orientation, as the Chinese do. They'll take over their own welcoming group and integration into their group, not into the university. They're taking care of each other, which is admirable, but it's also counterproductive in many ways.
Right.
And so I think one of the things that I am most, I don't know, proud isn't the word, that I'm most enamored of right now is this whole view of the interest in recruiting more foreign students for a variety of reasons, which we all know financial is one of them, is that those institutions who are doing it right are the ones who are doing a major self-examination. How much of what we do is predicated on the assumption that our student is American? How many of our forms, how many of our policies, how many of our procedures, how many of our choices of entry points and support mechanisms, how much of what we do is predicated on the fact we've got an 18 to 22-year-old American student graduating from an American high school.
Right.
And I would venture to say it's 99.8%. So what we're asking institutions to do now is to step back for a minute and do a really intense analysis of why are you not being inundated by competitive students who can get into your institution and stay there and graduate. Why is that not happening on a global scale? Because there is demand. There's 20 million students out there looking for a place to go, and they're not coming to your institution. Why is that? And so, you know, when you really look at it from that perspective, you find that, you know, you're not responding very fast, you don't have any representation in the field, you've your policies may preclude a student from ever coming to your institution because, you know, you've got this kind of myopic look at who these students are. Have to have an SAT score. Well, why? Is that a valid measure of this student's potential?
Right.
If their native language is not English, you know, what's the point of imposing an arbitrary TOEFL score, or even worse, a GPA, which doesn't exist anywhere else in the world and cannot be accurately translated into American standards, but yet we require it. And why is that? Because non-experts need something to go by to make decisions.
Right.
And it's specious. We know it's specious, but it's the only game in town. So why do we progress this way indefinitely? Right. Isn't there another way to do this?
Right.
Hence the birth of the pathway programs of the recent years and finding alternative ways to assess students.
And is that what you're involved in your private-public partnership or private higher ed partnership?
Yeah, exactly. And these are joint ventures, which is a financial model that is absolutely alien to higher education in America. Now, it's not that unusual in Australia, UK, Canada, other places. But in the United States, we've never needed it. So why would we do it?
Mm-hmm.
And the need has been fairly recent. Falling taxpayer support,
Falling endowments, right?
falling
Yeah.
endowments, falling birth rates
Right.
of our own students. You can't keep every university's doors open when there are fewer and fewer domestic students to fill those seats. So the whole
Reduced access to,
Yeah,
reduced financial access.
exactly. And so there are 100 reasons why universities are in dire straits right now. And one good reason why international students are looking better and better for people, but they don't quite know how to do it right. And the successful institution is the one that does this comprehensive re-examination, who wants to treat that student as an equal to all other students, who realizes that that student may need different services than the student over here, and is committed to making sure that all students are supported, all students are taught in the best way possible, taking that student where they are and getting them to where they need to go. And it's expensive. I mean, it doesn't happen by itself. It doesn't happen out of the international office. It happens with deans and faculty members and the health service and the residence halls and the food service and counseling and, you know, all of the services, the writing center, the ELI group, all of these come together to create an environment in which an international student can be successful. And very few American universities have their act together.
Right.
Very few. And the last thing they tend to attend to is the integration of that student with Americans. One of the biggest aspects of student satisfaction, international student satisfaction with where they went to school and graduated from, is how welcome they felt and how many friends they made among American students. And the vast majority will tell you that it was very hard for them to make real friendships, that most of their friends were foreign students,
Mm-hmm.
with whom they had a lot in common and were shared challenges, but that doesn't negate the fact that somehow within that academic community, that nexus was not taking place.
Right.
And it's because it's time consuming, it's got to be intentional, and you have to make the American students want to do it.
Right.
And that's the toughest trick. And so, I mean, I think we're doing better at this, but it's resource intensive. And one of the things that these public-private partnerships make possible is the generation of resources to reinvest in that comprehensive process of integrating that student socially, academically, emotionally into
Right.
that community for the long term, so that they become valuable and productive alums in a global network of that institution's resources
Right.
for the long term. And I think those things can happen, but they have to be intentional, they have to be supported at the very top level, and it involves changing the way you do things. And a lot of people don't like change.
Right.
Quite comfortable with things the way
Right.
they are.
Right. Well, that brings you to what you're doing now. And just as a footnote, I would mention that in the field of study abroad, the same problem exists with American students going abroad. It doesn't do any good
It was
to
a
sit next
factor in my experience.
to somebody who's, you know, at a university. You still have to figure out the way to both reach out and be reached out to. So it is an issue in our whole field. But I'm curious just to have you reflect a little bit backwards and say, look at what are the things now? Well, what were the issues then that you feel we've resolved? What are the issues now for this next generation that are coming up in our whole field? And you've really identified one of them just now.
I think there's a continuum of things. I don't think any of them are totally resolved.
Right.
I think we're going to far more interesting places now in terms of study abroad. I think more students from more majors are finding ways to incorporate that into their curriculum. I think those are huge leaps forward because it used to be just foreign language majors and international relation majors,
Right.
and mostly girls, you know.
Still mostly girls.
And going to standard places like London and Paris.
Mm-hmm.
And now I think we're seeing more experiential study abroad opportunities. I'm not sure that we're doing the best job preparing students for those opportunities.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting.
I think
A lot of debate about them, actually.
yeah, a lot of dropping kids, parachuting them into an orphanage in Botswana and then pulling them out. You know, this isn't a babysitting job, you know.
Right.
This is international development writ large. Why doesn't throwing money at it or volunteers at it solve the problem?
Right.
You know, I mean, I think you have to really understand the whole concept of the haves and the have-nots and why that is persistent
Right.
and resistant to some of the more obvious things that you think ought to be solving the problem. And why a 20-year-old or a 21-year-old from an American university, and I don't care how good that university is not going to go in and solve a problem in a 6-week summer program.
Of course.
And I think that kind of hubris is dangerous and could sabotage the whole idea of getting students to a point where they can see a problem, they can assess a problem, they can create some kind of a response to that problem and implement it. I think that's kind of the Clinton Global Initiative approach.
Right.
I think that's a valuable approach to making things relevant, making knowledge and skills relevant to these students, but to just have the experience of going to Africa and working with children and taking all the shots and posting them on Facebook is probably not contributing to the solution.
Right.
And I think we've got a lot more work to do there. But I love the direction that it's going, where it's not just taking an American classroom with an American faculty member and 15 students and moving them to London and touring museums together and going to plays together and maybe, you know, discussing it amongst themselves and maybe an occasional lecture come through from with a British accent. That to me is maybe an entry-level spring break excursion, but it's not education abroad. It's an American education with a movie set around it, you know. And I'm not sure that the impact of those kinds of experiences are what they need to be, because so much is done for the student.
Right.
And I know that the challenges, the growth that I made in my study abroad experience came at the expense of my ego. It came at the expense of my comfort. I was struggling at times, and I was a long way from home. And I didn't, I was just in France, but again,
That's a long way from
the
home.
2-week letter, you know? This was not, I mean, I called home on Christmas Day. That was the only phone call. Now it's, let's Skype. Did you ever really leave home? No. You're still hanging out with your friends. You're still talking to your mom. You know, I mean, study abroad has changed since we were doing this. And it's a lot easier, it's a lot more comfortable, but I'm just here to say that that struggle was worth something.
Mm-hmm. And I guess in conclusion, where do you see the field going? And where do you see an organization like AIEA going? I
think AIEA is growing fast because there are more and more people in this senior international officer position. And that includes community colleges.
Mhm.
And I think they're a very neglected piece of American higher education. When half of our students start in community colleges, that means that half of them find it even more challenging than four-year students in finding study abroad opportunities, just because of that slice right down the middle, where just as you're getting ready to go or getting prepared to do that, you're going to another school, and I think students really miss out on those experiences because of that break. I think that in terms of where it's going next, I think technology is really the big frontier. I think portability of degrees or of degree components is the next really tough challenge of how do you do half of your work at the University of Utrecht and half of your work at the University of Michigan and come out with a degree, without doubling up your time. How do we create the trust between academics globally that what they're doing at Utrecht and what they're doing at Michigan, both are of value?
Right.
This idea that we've created the perfect higher education program right here at this institution and no component of it can change or we can't give you the degree, to me is myopic and doing a disservice to students.
Right.
Because what you gain from that totally different approach and structure is really invaluable. The problem is accreditation.
Yes.
And that's the big hump to get over, is to find ways to validate the gestalt of the education, as opposed to saying this is the only way you can get a degree in finance.
Right.
With these components.
Right.
And if you could duplicate it at another institution, okay, great. That solves your problem as a faculty member. What it doesn't solve is the whole concept of a different perspective, of a different style, of a different content, which in most people's mind would constitute a positive outcome.
Mm-hmm.
But in this context, somehow it isn't. It's because we got a whole lot of bean counters.
Yeah.
And finding ways to stamp somebody on the forehead as educated is fraught with rules.
Yes. Yes. So that is one of the big issues yet to be faced.
Yeah.
Has to be faced.
I think we all have to, you all, anybody left in the crowd needs to really be comfortable with technology. And the good news is that the people coming up through the ranks were born in the age of computers.
Like the young woman who was helping us today, so that this actually happens.
Exactly. They were born in the age of computers, and they don't freeze at the idea of using technology in ways that you and I do. I mean, I have to call my son twice a week just to get past.
To turn on the TV.
Yes.
Right.
So, I mean, these are the kinds of generational changes, these contextual situations, comfort level with change and with innovation, and people's minds will automatically jump to technology, whereas mine jumps to relationships.
Right.
And I think those kinds of things are
that's interesting. That's
very
interesting.
different changes, different changes ahead, which is going to democratize it. I mean, it really is. That's the good news, and I don't think we can wait too long for that to happen.
Right. Well, you've contributed to getting international education to the point where it can happen, and you should feel very proud of that and proud of your work over this many years.
I have been blessed to do what I love and get paid for it.
I feel the same way, and I understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
Well, JoAnn, thank you so much for talking with us today. This is great to have this interview as part of the record of the development of our entire field and a part of a record of the work that you have contributed to it.
Yeah, thanks,
So I'm
Joan.
very grateful to have you here. Thanks.
Great fun.
Yeah.